The goats came into the auction ring looking like somebody had dragged 6 old rugs through a mesquite thicket and taught them how to walk. One man along the rail laughed before the auctioneer even opened the bidding. "Those things goats or floor mops?" Another man said he wouldn't feed them if somebody gave them to him. The animals stood under the August heat with long, tangled white coats hanging nearly to their knees, bits of grass and burrs caught in the curls. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody except Evelyn Mercer. She bought all 6 for $9. The laughter stopped just long enough for several men to turn and look at her. Evelyn didn't look back. She had already done the math. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and had been running 78 acres outside Junction, Texas, since her mother died and her father moved in with an older brother near San Angelo. The Mercer place had never been large. There were 24 acres that could be planted when the rain cooperated, a shallow creek that behaved like a creek only when it felt like it, 2 milk cows, 12 laying hens, and enough rocky pasture to support livestock that did not expect much from the ground. In 1933, expecting much from the ground was becoming an expensive habit. Wool prices had fallen. Cattle prices were worse. Feed cost money whether the animal made money or not. And for 3 years, Evelyn had watched neighboring families sell machinery, then livestock, then pieces of land in that order. Her father had left her one instruction: keep the place. He had not told her how. That part was apparently hers to figure out. The 6 goats in the back of her wagon were part of the answer. Not because of the goats themselves, because of what grew on them. Evelyn had first read the word mohair in a livestock circular 6 months earlier. She had known Angora goats existed, of course. Everybody in that part of Texas knew that. There were ranches farther west that ran them by the hundreds. But knowing an animal existed and understanding where the money came from were 2 different things. The circular mentioned that Angoras were commonly shorn twice a year. That sentence bothered her enough that she read it again. Twice a year. A steer gave you 1 animal when you sold it. A cotton field gave you 1 crop if the weather, boll weevils, prices, and God all happened to be in agreement. But an Angora goat grew another crop while standing in the pasture. Evelyn began writing letters. She wrote to a livestock agent in Kerrville. She wrote to 2 wool and mohair buyers in San Angelo. She wrote to a textile broker in Fort Worth, whose name she found in a trade notice wrapped around a shipment of feed. She asked questions most people did not bother asking. How much did clean mohair bring compared with stained fiber? What did buyers pay for kid hair? How much value was lost when burrs had to be removed? How much fiber could a mature doe produce in a year? What length did the mills prefer? How much did freight eat into a small shipment? The first 2 responses were polite and useless. The third contained numbers. The fourth contained better numbers. By June, she had a ledger on the kitchen table with 3 columns: feed, fiber, breeding stock. By July, she had run the same projections so many times that she could do most of them without opening the book. The 6 goats from the auction were not particularly good Angoras. That was why nobody wanted them. Their coats had been neglected. 2 were thin. 1 had a hoof that needed trimming. Another had enough cockleburs tangled along her flank to seed half the county. But 5 were young does. And beneath the dirt and burrs, the fiber had length. Evelyn had checked before bidding. That was the part the men at the rail had not noticed. She spent the next 3 days cleaning the goats, not washing them. Washing a fleece on the animal could create its own problems. She worked the worst debris loose by hand, trimmed what could not be saved, treated the bad hoof, checked teeth, and moved the animals into a pasture she had spent most of July repairing. Angoras were not cattle. That became clear in the first week. A fence a cow considered a boundary was sometimes a suggestion to a goat. Evelyn patched low places, tightened wire, and added cedar stays where the fence sagged. She built a small open front shelter from lumber, taken off an old equipment shed, because the letters she had received all said the same thing in different ways. Dry goats were profitable goats. Wet Angoras, especially after shearing, could become dead Angoras surprisingly fast. On the fourth morning, she found a man leaning against the west fence watching the herd. His name was Thomas Hale. He owned the 140 acres beyond the creek and had lived there long enough that Evelyn could not remember meeting him. He was 38, broad through the shoulders, quiet by habit, and had a way of standing still that made other people feel as though they were wasting motion. He nodded toward the goats. "I heard you bought the mop herd." "So I've been told. You know they went through your south fence yesterday?" "I know. They went through mine after that." Evelyn looked at him. "That part I did not know." Thomas nodded toward a white doe chewing cedar leaves, 15 feet from where she was supposed to be. "She likes my side. I'll repair it." "I already did." Evelyn turned to him. He shrugged. "They were eating my fence while I was fixing it." That was the first conversation they had about the goats. It was not the last. Thomas came back 4 days later to tell her the creek crossing needed another strand of wire. A week after that, he brought 2 used fence posts he said he had no need for. In September, he stopped by because he'd heard she was planning to shear and wanted to know whether she had ever done it before. She had not. "Then who's doing it?" "A man from Rock Springs." Thomas nodded. That should have ended the visit. It did not. He stayed another 40 minutes. The shearer arrived on a cool morning in late September with clippers, oil, canvas, and the impatient efficiency of a man who had handled several thousand goats and did not consider 6 of them a notable challenge. Evelyn had prepared a clean floor inside the barn. That mattered. Fiber that fell into mud was worth less. Fiber mixed with hay was worth less. Fiber stained with manure was worth less. Everything she had read came back to the same principle. Mohair did not become valuable because it came from an Angora goat. It became valuable when somebody protected its quality from the moment it started growing until the moment a buyer weighed it. The first doe produced a fleece just under 4 pounds. The second was better. The third had coarse fiber around the legs and belly that Evelyn separated into another sack. The youngest doe surprised the shearer. He ran a handful of her curls between his fingers, pulled one straight, and looked at Evelyn. "Don't mix this with the rest." "Why?" "Kid-type fiber. Finer." "She isn't a kid." "No, but she's carrying fine." He handed the lock back to her. "Buyer sees this clean. He'll know what it is." That single handful changed the way Evelyn looked at the herd. She had gone into the season thinking in pounds. More fleece meant more revenue. But that afternoon she began thinking in grades. Fine fiber, adult fiber, stained fiber, coarse fiber, same animal, different value. She went back to the ledger. 1 column became 4. In October, she bought a buck. He cost $22, which was more than twice what she had paid for the entire original group, and enough money that she spent 2 nights trying to talk herself out of it. His registered name was Blanco King 17. Evelyn disliked the name immediately and called him Amos. Amos came from a small ranch west of Kerrville, whose owner had been selecting Angoras for heavier, finer fleeces. The rancher had animals better than Amos. He also had animals costing $60 and more. Evelyn was not shopping in that part of the barn. She bought the best buck she could afford. Then she bred 4 of the does. The 5th needed another season. By December, all 4 appeared settled. Thomas Hale came by on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a coil of wire. "I've decided your goats are going to keep me in the fencing business." "I didn't ask you to bring that." "No." "You planning to charge me?" "No." "Then why'd you bring it?" He looked past her toward Amos, who was standing on a rock with the solemn expression of an animal, convinced the rock had been placed there specifically for him. Thomas thought about the question. "Your buck was halfway through my fence." "That still doesn't explain why you brought the whole coil." "No." He put it beside the shed. Evelyn waited. Thomas looked at the goats again. I'm interested in seeing whether this works. The fence? The goats? She almost smiled. That all? He looked at her then. No. He did not explain further. She did not ask him to. That was enough for December. The winter was dry and colder than Evelyn wanted. She fed carefully. Every extra pound of grain appeared twice in the ledger, once as an expense and once as a question. Would it come back in fleece? Would it come back in kids? Would it come back at all? She learned quickly that an animal did not care how elegant a projection looked on paper. A goat could get sick. A doe could fail to breed. Rain could arrive the week of shearing. A buyer could change his price. The whole operation worked only if the numbers survived contact with the animals. In February, the first kidding shelter was ready. Evelyn had built it against the south side of the barn using scrap lumber, 2 doors from an abandoned chicken house, and tin she traded for 3 days of bookkeeping at the feed store. Thomas helped set the roof. Neither of them discussed why he was there. On March 3rd, the first doe kidded twins, a buck and a doe. The second delivered 1 large doe 2 days later. The third had twins. The fourth had trouble. Evelyn found her before daylight, restless and straining, and knew within 10 minutes that something was wrong. She sent Thomas's hired boy for the veterinarian. Thomas came instead. They worked in the lantern light for nearly 2 hours before the kid finally came. It was alive. So was the mother. By the end of the week, Evelyn had 6 kids from 4 does, 4 females, 2 males. She wrote the number in the ledger, 6, then beneath it, 5 strong, 1 watch. The smallest doe kid spent 3 nights in a box near the kitchen stove. Evelyn fed her from a bottle every few hours. Thomas came by the second evening and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the kid asleep and a towel on her lap, and the ledger open beside her. You put that in the books? What? The goat in the kitchen. Not yet. He pulled out a chair. What column? Bad decisions. Thomas looked at the kid. Seems healthy for a bad decision. She lived. Evelyn named her June. By spring, people in town had begun asking about the Angoras. Not with respect. Not yet. At the feed store, Walter Briggs called them Evelyn's ladies because of their long curls. Someone else called them carpet goats. A rancher she barely knew told her she could have bought 3 decent sheep for what she had spent getting the Angora pasture ready. Evelyn asked whether he wanted to see her ledger. He said no. She said that was probably best. The first real test came in April. The goats were ready for spring shearing. This time Evelyn did not have 6 animals. She had the original does, Amos, and enough usable fiber from the younger animals to make sorting worth the trouble. She spent the day before shearing, sweeping the barn floor, laying canvas, labeling sacks, and setting up a table made from 2 sawhorses and an old door. Fine, adult, coarse, stained. 4 categories, 4 prices, 4 ways to turn the same morning's work into either more money or less money depending on how carefully she handled it. Thomas arrived before the shearer. You need help? I have help. He looked around. Who? The shearer. He's shearing. Yes. Who's moving goats? Evelyn looked at him. Thomas took off his hat and hung it on a nail. That's what I thought. They worked until after 3. By the time the last fleece was tied, Evelyn's back hurt. Thomas had a cut across one knuckle, and Amos had developed a personal dislike for everyone involved. But the fiber was clean. That was what mattered. Evelyn weighed every sack twice. The finest lot was smaller than she wanted. The adult fiber was better than she had expected. The coarse sack was exactly as disappointing as coarse fiber had every right to be. She shipped the best 2 lots to the Fort Worth broker she had been corresponding with for 10 months. Then she waited. 9 days. 10. 11. On the 12th day, there was an envelope in the mailbox. Evelyn carried it into the kitchen without opening it. She put water on the stove. She fed the chickens. She checked the smallest kid. She came back inside. The envelope was still there. She opened it with a butter knife. The statement listed weight, grade, freight, commission, and final payment. Evelyn read it once, then again. The fine mohair had brought considerably more per pound than the mixed lot she had used in her original projections. The adult fiber had landed almost exactly where she expected. The check was for $41.80. It was not a fortune. It was not even close. But those goats were still standing in the pasture. Their hair was already growing back. That was the part Evelyn kept looking at. The $41 had not required selling the herd. The product had left. The factory remained. She opened the ledger. Feed, shearing, freight. Buck cost amortized across breeding, repairs, then revenue. The first commercial clip had cleared a little over $23 after direct costs. $23 from animals, most of the auction barn had considered worthless. She wrote the number down in black ink. Then she turned the pencil over in her fingers and stared out the kitchen window. There were 11 Angoras in the south pasture now. By the following spring, if the 4 young does developed properly, there could be more. And every one of them would grow another fleece. If you're wondering whether Evelyn had finally proven everybody wrong, not yet. She had proven 6 goats could make money. What she had not proven was whether 6 goats could become 60 without eating the farm first. That was the next calculation. By summer, Evelyn had stopped thinking of the animals as one herd. There was the breeding group, the replacement does, the market kids, the animals producing the best fiber, and 2 does whose fleeces were consistently coarse enough that keeping them long-term made less sense every time she sharpened the pencil. That was a harder lesson. She liked both animals. One of them, May, followed her around the pasture like a dog. But affection was not a revenue category. May's next doe kid showed better fiber than her mother. Evelyn kept the kid and marked May for sale after the fall clip. She hated writing it down. She wrote it down anyway. The operation improved because she was willing to make decisions before they became emergencies. She started recording fleece weight by animal, then kid survival, then feed consumption by group. She marked which does produce twins. She marked which fleeces arrived clean. She marked which animals spent half their lives crawling under cedar and brought half the pasture back in their hair. Patterns appeared. The best goat was not necessarily the goat with the heaviest fleece. A 7-pound fleece full of debris could be worth less than a 5-pound fleece that sorted clean. A doe that raised twins and produced moderate fiber might outperform a heavier-producing doe that struggled to keep a kid alive. The ledger got more complicated. The business got simpler. By October, Evelyn knew which animals were paying for themselves. She also knew something else. The south pasture was too small. Thomas saw it before she mentioned it. He stood at the fence one Tuesday morning, while 12 goats moved along the cedar line, clipping brush with the steady determination of men clearing railroad right-of-way. "You're going to run out of ground," he said. "I know." "How soon?" "Spring." "That soon?" "If I keep the 4 young does." "You're keeping them?" "Yes." He nodded. They both looked east. Across the county road sat 96 acres belonging to the Bell family, or what had belonged to the Bell family. The bank had taken possession in July. The house was empty. The fences were bad, the field had gone weedy, but behind it was nearly 60 acres of rough pasture covered in cedar, live oak, and brush that cattle barely used. Goats would use it. Evelyn had been thinking about the Bell place for 3 months. She had not permitted herself to call that thinking a plan. The bank wanted $750. $750 was a number large enough to stop feeling like money and start feeling like weather. You did not argue with it. You waited to see what it did. But Evelyn had something in 1934 that she had not had in 1933. Records. She had 2 commercial clips. She had breeding numbers. She had 12 months of expenses. And she had a buyer in Fort Worth who had written her in September asking whether she expected to increase volume the following year. That letter stayed folded inside the ledger. She read it every few days. Not because the wording changed, because her willingness to believe it did. The fall clip was better than spring. More animals, cleaner fleeces, better sorting. The fine lot from the young goats brought the highest return she had received yet. She sold 2 wethers. She sold May after shearing. She kept 4 replacement does. At the end of December, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and totaled the operation for the year. Fiber revenue, breeding and livestock sales, feed, veterinary expenses, shearing, freight, fence, buck, net. She checked the arithmetic, then checked it again. The goats had produced more usable cash than the planted portion of the farm. Not theoretically, not projected, actually. Thomas came by the next Tuesday. By then Tuesday had become his day, although neither of them had ever agreed to it. Sometimes he brought something, sometimes he did not. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes, sometimes he stayed through supper. Evelyn put the ledger in front of him. He looked at her. What am I looking at? The year. He sat down. Thomas read numbers the same way he did everything else, slowly enough that he rarely had to do it twice. He turned one page. Then another. You've got your buck cost in here twice. No. First one is purchase, second is feed. He looked again. Right, he continued. After several minutes, he leaned back. The goats beat the field. Yes. By a fair amount. Yes. He tapped the page once. You're buying the Bell place. It was not a question. I've talked to the bank. Thomas looked up. When? November. You didn't say anything. I wasn't sure there was anything to say. And now? They'll carry most of it if I put 20% down. You have 20%? I will, after the next clip. Thomas looked toward the window. Beyond it, June was standing with both front feet on a water trough, for reasons known only to June. The east fence is terrible, he said. I know. Creek crossing's worse. I know. You'll need another shelter. I know. He was quiet. Then he looked back at the ledger. You've already priced it. Yes. Posts? Yes. Wire? Yes. Roofing? Yes. Thomas nodded. Of course you have. Evelyn closed the ledger. I haven't bought anything. No. What? You already decided. She knew he was right. That bothered her for almost 5 seconds. Then it did not. The spring clip of 1935 put the down payment in her bank account. The Fort Worth buyer took everything Evelyn shipped and asked for more fine fiber if she could produce it. She did not celebrate. She took the check to town. She deposited it. She walked 3 doors down to the bank. And 43 minutes later, she signed papers that made 96 additional acres hers. Evelyn drove home with the deed inside a brown envelope on the seat beside her. At the county road, she stopped. The Bell place lay beyond the fence, winter brown and rough. The farmhouse needed work. The barn leaned. Half the posts along the west line would have to come out. Someone else might have looked at the property and seen everything wrong with it. Evelyn looked at the brush. She saw goat feed. She looked at the slope above the creek. She saw kidding pasture. She looked at the old barn. She saw a shearing floor. That was when she understood what had changed. 2 years earlier, every problem on a piece of land had looked like a cost. Now some problems looked like capacity. Thomas arrived the following Tuesday. He had already heard. News traveled faster than trucks in a small county. He stood at the gate with a post-hole digger over one shoulder. Evelyn looked at it. You planning to congratulate me with manual labor? Thought it was practical. It is. Thomas looked across the road toward the new land. Walk it? They crossed together. The Bell pasture was rougher from inside than it had looked from the road. 3 fence posts were completely rotten. The creek crossing had washed out. The barn roof had 2 holes Evelyn had not noticed. Thomas pointed at the first one. That'll leak. I can see that. He pointed at the second. That one too. I bought land, Thomas. I didn't lose my eyesight. He smiled. It was a small smile. Thomas did most things small. They walked another 100 yards. At the top of the rise, the whole property opened below them. The old Mercer place lay west of the road. The new pasture spread east. For the first time, Evelyn could see both at once. Her original 78 acres, the 96 she had just bought, the goats moving like white dots along the old cedar line. The animals that had started all of this. Not the exact 6. 2 had been sold. 1 had died the previous winter. But their daughters were there, and their daughters' daughters. June was there too, no longer small, carrying one of the best fleeces in the herd. Thomas stopped beside her. You know what the men at the auction called them? Evelyn looked at him. You weren't there. I heard. Everybody heard. Floor mops. Walking brooms too. Thomas watched the herd. Expensive brooms, not when I bought them. No. The wind moved across the hill, carrying the dry smell of cedar and limestone. Thomas pushed the point of the post-hole digger into the ground. You'll need help getting the east fence done before you turn them in. I know. I could start Tuesday. You come every Tuesday already? He looked at her. That a complaint? No. They stood there longer than the conversation required. Then Evelyn said, Come for supper first. Thomas's expression changed just enough for her to see that he understood exactly what she had said, and exactly what she had not. What time? 6. I'll be here. And Thomas? Yes? Don't bring fence wire to supper. He nodded. I'll leave it in the truck. That evening, Evelyn opened the ledger one more time. The first pages were still there. 6 goats. $9. Fence repair. Feed estimate. Possible spring clip. Questions in the margins. Numbers written by a woman who had been trying not to lose 78 acres. The later pages looked different. More animals. More columns. More revenue. More expenses too. The operation had not become easier. It had become larger. There was a difference. Outside the window, the Angoras moved slowly through the fading light. Their coats were cleaner now than they had been that first day. Long white curls caught the last sun along their backs. They still looked ridiculous from certain angles. Evelyn had come to appreciate that. There was something useful about an animal that did not look valuable to people who had never bothered to understand it. The whole opportunity had been sitting in plain sight. That was the strange part. The goats had not changed. Mohair had not suddenly started growing on them after she bought them. The mills had wanted fiber before Evelyn ever wrote her first letter. The animals had been producing it while men at the auction laughed at their coats. What changed was that one person took the trouble to ask what those coats were worth. Then she asked what made one fleece worth more than another. Then she asked how often the animals produced it. Then she asked what it cost to keep them alive between clips. Then she asked how many she could support on the land she already owned. And when the answer became not enough, she asked what the land next door cost. That was how the farm grew. Not in one brave decision, in questions, letters, receipts, fence posts, bad weather, 6 kids born in a cold barn, a $41 check that proved something small but important, a ledger that kept proving it again. If you've stayed with Evelyn this far, think about the beginning for a moment. 6 animals entered an auction ring. Everybody there could see the same goats, the same dirty coats, the same burrs, the same skinny legs, the same $9 opportunity. What they did not see was the second fleece, or the third. They did not see the kids that had not been born yet. They did not see the fine fiber separated from the coarse. They did not see the buyer in Fort Worth. They did not see the 96 acres across the road. Evelyn did not see all of that either. Not at first. She saw only enough to take the next step. That turned out to be enough. Years later, people around Junction would remember the Angora herd as though Evelyn had always known what it would become. People do that after something works. They take a long series of uncertain decisions and turn them into one obvious idea. It was never obvious. The first goats were poor. The fencing cost more than she wanted. One doe nearly died kidding. The first commercial clip made $23 after direct expenses. $23 does not feel like destiny when you're holding it. It feels like $23. But Evelyn understood what the number represented. The goats were still there. Their coats were growing back. That was enough evidence to continue. And then she continued longer than most people would have. That was the part nobody at the auction could have priced. By the following fall, goats were moving through the bell pasture, stripping cedar tips and brush from land cattle had mostly ignored. The old barn had a new section of roof. The creek crossing had fresh wire. Thomas's fence posts stood along the east boundary in a line so straight, Evelyn accused him of showing off. He denied it. She did not believe him. On Tuesdays, he still came over. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they ate first. After a while, the order became less important. And on the kitchen table, the ledger remained open. Feed in one column, fiber in another, breeding stock in a third. There was no column for luck. Evelyn had never trusted luck enough to give it one. There was no column for what people thought at the auction either. That turned out to have even less value. She had bought animals nobody wanted, because she understood something simple. A thing can look useless and still produce something valuable. But seeing that is only the beginning. You still have to write the letters. You still have to ask the buyer what he actually pays for. You still have to separate the good fiber from the bad. You still have to repair the fence after the goats discover the weak spot before you do. You still have to get up at 2 in the morning when a doe is in trouble. You still have to sell the animal you like when the numbers tell you she no longer belongs in the breeding herd. And when the first check comes, you do not mistake proof for success. You use the proof to build the next piece. 6 goats became a herd. The herd became fiber. The fiber became checks. The checks became land. And somewhere between the first broken fence and the new one going up across the bell pasture, the woman who had spent years trying only to keep what her father left her realized she had stopped defending the old farm. She was building a bigger one. That was a different kind of life. And it had started with 6 ridiculous-looking goats that everybody else had already decided were worth nothing.